Welcome to the I Told You So podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Ben Cole. I started this podcast because I noticed an erosion of societal discourse and how normal conversations are often fueled by polarization. The I Told You So podcast offers an opportunity for healthy discourse and effective debate. I select topics to discuss and debate with listeners and guests of the I Told You So podcast. Listeners and guests predict what will happen in the future. I track predictions and announce who predicted accurately when those predictions become true. The podcast offers topics where listeners and guests can discuss and debate with the goal of predicting the future so they can proudly say, I told you so. My guest for this episode is Dr. Glynn Tonsor. Glynn Tonsor is a professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Kansas State University. Glynn grew up on a farrow-to-finish swine farm in Monroe City, Missouri. Glynn Tonsor obtained a Bachelor of Science from Missouri State University and a PhD from Kansas State University. He was a faculty member at Michigan State University from May 2006 to March 2010 when he joined the Kansas State University faculty. Dr. Tonsor has broad interests and experiences that span many issues throughout the meat livestock supply chain. Through active research, engaged outreach with industry, and first-hand knowledge with livestock production, Dr. Tonsor has economic expertise in an array of topics of economic importance to Kansas, the U.S., and to global stakeholders. Dr. Tonsor has over 118 peer-reviewed publications. He has provided over 300 presentations to an in-person audience exceeding 37,000 attendees. He's conducted numerous educational webinars, and he's written a multitude of non-technical publications. Dr. Tonsor oversees the Meat Demand Monitor, or MDM. It's a project based at Kansas State University. Dr. Tonsor has testified to both state and federal government bodies, in addition to regularly engaging many agricultural media outlets. Dr. Tonsor has been interviewed or cited by broader outlets including the BBC News, CBS Evening News, Economist, National Geographic, Time, and the Wall Street Journal. Dr. Tonsor and his wife, Shauna, live in St. George, Kansas, with their children Ethan, Levi, and Aubrey. On this episode, Dr. Tonsor and I discuss the Meat Demand Monitor project and meat consumption topics of general interest. So, Dr. Tonsor, thanks for being a guest on the I Told You So podcast. Let me start our conversation by asking you, let me start by this. You lead this project I mentioned, the MDM project, and that's happening at Kansas State University. So could you maybe give us an overview of that MDM project for our audience?
Yeah, happy to do that, Ben, and thanks for having me on. So the MDM, as you said, the Meat Demand Monitor project, is a very intense online survey-based project. Every month since February of 2020, we survey over 2,000 people. It's closer to 3,000 most months. And we're asking them in that survey a lot of things about what they consumed the prior day. So, for example, I could tell you if you had pork for breakfast, chicken for lunch, and beef for dinner, or you didn't prior day. So we're tracking consumption preferences. So, what's the relative role of safety versus an environmental claim, those kind of things in your decisions, as well as demand. So what your willingness to pay for a ribeye steak or a pork chop might be. So it's a pretty intense effort. As you said, it's based here at K-State. K-State is one of many land-grant universities here in the U.S. These kind of projects, in my job here at K-State, they can function well at an unbiased source like a university. It is funded by the Beef and Pork Checkoff because they have a vested interest in understanding, right, what the domestic meat consumption and demand story is. Everything we're going to talk about today is publicly available. So I'm sure we'll say this at the end, but I'll do it a couple times. Is, your attendees are welcome to email me for more. But if you go to our Ag Manager, so agmanager.info website here at K-State, you'll find everything about this project. So the raw survey data, the instruments we use, monthly reports, deep reports. I mean, there's a wealth of info there. Hopefully that gives your attendees kind of an overview of this large survey project. And we'll talk about some of the ongoing findings, I'm sure, as we go forward here.
All right. So there seems to be maybe some discussion in the role of meat in U.S. diets and the prevalence of a vegan or vegetarian diet. What can you say about that?
Yeah, so one of the simple questions, again, we've asked since February 2020 of a nationally representative group of U.S. residents is, how do you describe your diet? And it's a simple multiple choice question, and I think it's important people understand how we ask this, is, do you consider yourself a regular consumer of animal products, i.e. are you a regular meat consumer? Are you a flexitarian? So you're still a customer of the meat industry, but you periodically avoid meat, right? So you have some meals you intentionally avoid meat. Are you a vegan? Are you a vegetarian? And we have an other or none apply kind of option. So I make folks, right, tell me one of those. What I want to impress on your listeners here is there's no clear evidence of growth in the vegan vegetarian rate. And just to timestamp this for a moment, you and I are talking in June 2024. In May of 24, which is the most recent data I have to look at in this exercise, 8% told us they are vegan vegetarian. That's down from 13% in May of 2021, 14% in May of 2020. So even that simple example, comparing a few months of May in the last few years, that rate is down. But I want to go further and say it's my opinion that that's actually overstated. There's something called social desirability bias. So sometimes people will say what they think the researcher is fishing for or what they think somebody wants them to say in a survey. And if there's a social kind of pressure to say I'm a vegan or vegetarian, but you're really not, that would be inflating those numbers. And the reason I interject that for you, Ben, is early in this survey, as I said, we asked, what did you have yesterday for breakfast, lunch, and dinner? And there are some months in this effort where there's people that tell me I had a meat item yesterday, and they later tell me they were a vegan vegetarian. That doesn't add up, right? So, they're checking that box for some other reason. And the reason I say that here is I think that 8% in May of 2024 is the ceiling on truth. I think the actual vegan vegetarian rate is lower. But despite that, there's no evidence that that's growing, is the real point that I want to emphasize for your listeners.
All right. Yeah. So there's also a lot of news about consumer frustration. We're getting a little bit of feedback, so maybe I'll wait for that. Okay. There's been a lot of news about consumer frustration with the cost of living and inflation rates and their general financial situation. So are there insights from the MDM project that you can share about that?
There is, and I agree with your general read about the news on financial concerns, but I'll go further before I give you the MDM point. Is one of the things you're alluding to for our listeners is the Federal Reserve is a well-trusted data resource in the country, and they regularly point to the median income in the U.S., and you can adjust it for inflation. So we kind of have a tracking of what the buying power that is. And the median real purchasing powers actually went up in the last year. But you won't pick up on that tone in the media because there's frustration, right, alluded to in the media. And that frustration shows up in the MDM effort as well. That's why you're asking me here. One of the very simple questions we've asked from the start of this project is, how do you consider your household finances now compared to a year ago? Do you consider them better, the same, or worse? And again, the most recent info is for May 24. Only 16% of the respondents in May told us their finances are better than they were in May 2023. 47% say they're the same, effectively no change. And then over a third, 37% specifically, tell us they've eroded. I think what's going on under that is the sentiment, right, or pessimism is what we're picking up on there, is your household budget might be slightly improving, but you're not confident in it, right? There's other things in the general arena around you that's making you pessimistic in how you answer my survey question, is the point. That shows up in the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Index. That's been going on for like 50 years. You'll find that in the general news, and other, similar survey efforts that are done at other universities. The punchline for your listeners here, before I make a meat point, is just as general U.S. residents, you can be pessimistic even if your finances are improving. So if you're concerned about the future, you're probably going to have a pessimistic tone in these surveys, and we've picked up on that for several months. The part that's relevant there for the meat meat geeks like me that track these things. Remember, the whole project's called the Meat Demand Monitor, so we're focused on meat stuff. Is if you tell me your finances have improved, you also told me you consumed beef, pork, or chicken yesterday at a much higher rate. And that's not surprising. Meat protein is one of the more expensive items, right, in our grocery cart and our general food budget. So if you're concerned about your finances, you're probably going to tighten your wallet in lots of places, including on the meat demand and meat consumption front. The part that's relevant for the beef and pork industries that support this project is if only 16% are telling me that their finances are improving, that's a challenge, right, for domestic meat demand. Domestic meat demand is a little stronger than that alone would indicate, but that headwind on consumer sentiment is what I'm trying to impress here. And simply looking at Federal Reserve kind of real buying power kind of numbers doesn't tell the whole story. You could be gainfully employed, your wages outpacing your cost of living, but if you're not sure that's going to hold up in the future, you're probably going to have some pessimistic responses in how you respond to surveys and how willing you are to pay up for a branded ribeye steak product or some extra, cool boneless pork chop. Your meat demand might be muted because you're pessimistic.
Well, great thoughts. Really appreciate the comments. So, Dr. Tonsor, thanks so much for being a guest on the I Told You So podcast. So, if listeners would like to learn more about Dr. Tonsor and the MDM project, you can go ahead and email or send an email to Dr. Tonsor at gtonsor@ksu.edu. That's got some feedback again, gtonsor@ksu.edu. Or like Dr. Tonsor mentioned, the agmanager.info for more MDM info. Now, because this podcast is about predicting the future, my questions to those listening are, do you think the vegetarian and vegan diet will increase in the near future? Another question, will the public become more optimistic about finances within the next year? And will the USA export more meat than we consume? So I kind of like to hear Dr. Tonsor's thoughts on maybe these questions. Maybe let's start with the first one. Dr. Tonsor, do you think that there'll be an increase or maybe, pardon the pun, an appetite for a vegetarian vegan diet in the near future?
Yeah, great question. I think those diets will persist, but I don't expect them to grow as a share of the U.S. resident population. And to timestamp that for a moment, again, we're talking in the middle of 2024. I earlier said about 8% told me vegan, vegetarian applies to them. And I try to explain why I think that's overstated. Truth might be more like 4 or 5%. And there's other survey efforts out there that would put it at 4 or 5%. So I'd like to benchmark the number here for a little bit. I anticipate in our country of over 300 million people, we will continue to have some that are vegan, vegetarian, and that's okay. This is a resident U.S. There's room for multiple diets. I'm not against it. But I don't anticipate that becoming 15% of the population, right? Which would be something like doubling, right? It's hard for me to come up with an example where that'd be the case. And one of the reasons that I think that's my view, at least, Ben, is there is a strong demand for protein among many U.S. residents and, frankly, residents around the globe. And one of the most desired sources of protein is meat. Now, it's not the only, right? I mean, there's eggs, there's peanut butter, there's a lot of other ways to get protein in your diet, some of which would be eligible for vegan, vegetarian diet. But that general pull for protein demand, I think, is a headwind for more vegan, vegetarian growth. So it's hard for me to see that diet becoming much more prevalent than it is.
All right, well, let's move to the second question that I asked our listeners. Will the public become more optimistic about finances within the next year? And I know you touched on this a little bit, but maybe you can expand on it.
Yeah, so in the next year, I'm not sure. So again, timestamp, we're talking in June of 2024. This fall, we have a very interesting discussion when it comes to elections and so forth, is probably the word to use. And I highlight that not to make this political, but I think some of the sentiment that I'm picking up on is a broader sentiment in our country of frustration. And it doesn't really matter which way you vote. I think there's frustrations. It's possible, and I hope that once we get past the November elections, some of that improves. So I'm not optimistic things are going to improve between now and, say, Thanksgiving, right? But by the time we get into early 2025, so I'm changing the time period here a little bit, right? Let's get 8 months out and so forth. It might improve because we'll have a little more certainty on the political front, is the point. At the same time, most forecasts are that inflation will be stable or down over that period. Time will tell if that occurs. The economist in me says we can't take that for granted. That is the current forecast. So if you have stable or lower inflation and we get some resolve on the political front, I think that could spill over into some more financial sentiment improvement. But we probably won't see it until after the holidays here at the end of 2024.
Okay. And the last question I ask the listeners, will the USA export more meat than we consume?
Yeah. So I didn't allude to this earlier, but I'll give a little context. You noted in my background, I grew up on a hog farm. So we produce more beef, pork, and chicken in the U.S. than we consume. And the reason that math works out is we produce more than we consume, which means we export some of it, right? So we are a large meat-producing country. There's a lot of economic reasons for that. We have comparative advantages of doing it, and I don't anticipate that changing. And global demand for protein, I'm actually even more optimistic on than domestic, which is a pull factor, right? So the U.S. and other major meat-producing countries are probably going to remain very present in that production effort. So my answer would be yes. I think we will continue and frankly expand the amount we produce relative to what's consumed here in the U.S.
Okay. So you heard Dr. Tonsor's answers to those questions, and I pose those same questions to you as the listeners. So I'd like to know what you think. So please engage with me, and you also can follow up with Dr. Tonsor as well with the email address that I provided earlier. So let me know what you think. Text or call me at 1-785-473-3721 or send an email message to ITYS at bencoleiTYS.com. That's ITYS at, all one word, bencoleiTYS.com, or post on any of my social media channels. If there is another podcast platform you prefer, please let me know that too. So I ask you to go to the I Told You So podcast website at bencoleiTYS.com to connect and get your own I Told You So items at the merchandise link. So you can choose for shirts and hoodies and hats and mugs and coffee mugs and lots of other items. So let me tell you that the I Told You So podcast is really, at least I hope, a space for healthy discourse and effective debate with the goal of predicting the future so you can proudly say, I told you so. So also, if your business or organization is interested in advertising on the I Told You So podcast, please let me know that too. So thanks for tuning in to the I Told You So podcast, and thanks again to my guest, Dr. Glynn Tonsor from Kansas State University. Followers of the podcast are very important, so please follow, like, subscribe, leave a comment, and give a high rating if you can, and share with your friends. So again, thanks for tuning in, and I'm your host, Dr. Ben Cole, and I hope to hear from you soon.